Alright guys, welcome back to the third part of the second part of the thorax. I know it's taking long, but this was supposed to be done on a Monday and a Wednesday, and unfortunately I don't have that time with you guys anymore with that snow break, so let's continue on. The right atrium, we're going to talk about some key features here, and it's very equivalent to the left atrium in some sense. But let's talk about the things that you will be finding in both the left and right atrium. So both the left and right atrium you'll have muscle. It's a very thin muscle. It's called musculi pectinati. They're just small little muscles that help contract the atrium on the right ventricle as well as the left. The other thing you'll see is where the atrium meets vessels and all. You'll have stuff called the crista terminalis. So where the muscle lies and it ends up with smooth, it's called the crista terminalis. So if you notice, there's a smooth endothelium here, and then muscle. So the smooth endothelium, where it meets with the musculi pectinati, that's called the crista terminalis. It's just an indentation of where the muscle is different from one end to the next. All right, now let's talk about things that are different from between the right and the left atrium. In the right atrium, you have the fossa ovalis. This was once open. It was called the foramen ovale when you were a fetus. And like the ductus arteriosus up here, between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, this also fed the right side of the heart to give to the lung. So you had two shunts to give to the lungs. You had the ductus arteriosus as well as the foramen ovale when it was open. So when you take a breath, when you're born, and you take a breath, the reason the doctor slaps you on the butt to make you cry is because we want the left side of the heart to build up pressure to shut this. So when the left side of the heart increases pressure, it shuts the valve and shuts this foramen ovale, and it creates a indentation left over, and it's called fossa ovalis because now it's no longer a hole, it's just a depression, and it looks like an oval shape. So that's where it gets its name. Okay, and this will come in handy when we hit some defects in a little bit, but that's the main thing you'll see on the right atrium. The SA node, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is up here near the coronary sinuses. I mean, at the coronary sinuses, the superior vena cava. So it sits about right here. The AB node is down here near the ventricle, near the septum. They're invisible. You cannot see them, guys. I'm just giving you an indentation where they would be. But what you will see in gross anatomy is you see the fossa ovalis. You'll see the opening to the coronary sinus down here in the inferior portion. Remember, that is the vein that is draining all the venous supply from the heart straight into the right atrium. You'll see the opening to the superior vena cava up here, the opening to the inferior vena cava down here, and that's about it you'll find in the right ventricle. So one key feature is you have three vessels that enter the right atrium. I said right ventricle, the right atrium. So you have the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus. I know I sound like a broken record, but that's going to probably be on the test, so something good to know. Those are the three vessels that enter the right atrium. Okay, now let's move along to the right ventricle. In the right ventricle, the right atrium is already filled up with blood, pushes blood down into the right ventricle. It enters the right ventricle through this atrioventricular valve known as the tricuspid valve. It's called tricuspid because it has three cusps. It has the anterior cusp, the septal cusp near the ventricular septum, and the posterior cusp. So these three cusps are there as a valve. They work unanimously to shut the valve and open the valve to allow blood to enter the ventricle as well as escape the ventricle. So they're one way. Its only job is to take blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle, not vice versa. So when the right ventricle fills up with blood and contracts, this valve shuts. And this valve up here, superiorly known as the semilunar valve, the pulmonary valve to be exact, it's a semilunar valve, but its name is the pulmonary valve because it goes to the pulmonary trunk. It has three cusps. So it has, this is anterior. You have an anterior cusp, a right and left semilunar cusp. But because the pulmonary trunk is anterior and the aorta is posterior, this one has an anterior cusp, whereas the aorta has a posterior cusp. We'll get to that in a little bit. So that's also found in the right ventricle. You have the tricuspid valve that allows blood to enter from the right atrium into the ventricle, and you have the pulmonary valve that allows blood to leave when the ventricle contracts It opens, allows blood to escape to the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries to get to the lungs. Okay? Now, let's go over some features that you will find in both ventricles. You will have trabeculae carne, or carne. It means meat, a network of meat, of muscle. So if you notice all these muscles, remember up here in the atrium you have musculini pectinae. So if you look at this again, oops, sorry, you have musculini pectinae up here. Well, in the ventricle, it's a different name, bigger muscle, and it's called the actual trabeculae carne. If you notice, there is a conus arteriosus where it's smooth because blood is escaping there. It's not the actual muscle contracting. So, like the atrium, there is a smooth part as well as a muscular part. Nonetheless, it's just got different names. Also, you have papillary muscles. Papillary muscles attached to cords called chordae tendinae. They're called tendons because they actually attach from muscle to valve. So they're attaching a muscle to a skeleton network like bone. Except it's not bone, it's fibrous connective tissue, which is why they're called tendinae. They're called cords because they look like little strings, like little cords. So you have papillary muscles for each cusp. You have anterior papillary muscles, posterior papillary muscles, and septal papillary muscles for each cusp for the tricuspid valve. Their job is to seal the valve shut. So when the valve closes, this valve is sealed shut so blood cannot go back up to the atrium. Remember, this is a one-way valve, just like the semilunar valve up here. So unlike the semilunar valve, they both rely on pressure. The difference is that this has so much pressure that it has to prevent it from going back to the atrium. So to prevent that, it has muscles to help contract this valve to close it to prevent that regurgitation back to the atrium. So papillary muscles are very unique and they're only found in the ventricle. Chordae tendinae are also very unique and only found in the ventricle. And then of course you have trabeculae carne or carne, which is also unique and only found in the ventricles. So those three key features are found in both ventricles. The tricuspid valve and pulmonary valve are only found in the right ventricle. Okay, so let's move on. The pulmonary valve, you look, it's semilunar because it looks like they have crescent moon cusps, which they get that's where it gets the semilunar valve. But it's called pulmonary because it's leading to the pulmonary trunk as pulmonary arteries. Now, if you recall, the pulmonary trunk is anterior. So you'll have an anterior cusp and a left and right cusp. Okay? Whereas the aortic valve is going to be a little different. Now this valve is regulated by pressure. So when the ventricle contracts, it opens the valve and allows blood to escape and then shuts when the ventricle loses pressure. So when the ventricle is filling up with blood and loses pressure because all the blood is ejected, the valve shuts and it prevents blood from regurgitating back into the ventricle. It's a one-way valve from the ventricle out of the body, out of the heart into the lungs. Okay, whereas the atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid, was a one-way valve from the atrium to the ventricle. Alright, moving right along. Let's get to the left atrium. You can see the remnant of the fossa ovalis on this side, particularly the valve that's shut when you took that first breath. So that is a key feature on the left side. Also, you'll see the orifices to the pulmonary veins. You'll have 4 of them, 2 for the left, 2 for the right pulmonary veins. And those holes, they signify where the blood is coming from the lungs. So you do have those 2 holes. There's your, up here you have your musculini pectinae. Here, one key feature you have both on the left atrium are auricles. Think they're called lobes. Auricle just means lobe. So it's the auricle of the atrium. Their job is just to increase surface area so you get more blood, more bang for your buck. So that's the left atrium altogether. You have 4 holes. The 4 holes are for the pulmonary veins. You do have a remnant of a hole called the foramen ovale, or the valve of the foramen ovale that was once there. But you can't see the fossa too much because the valve is covering some of it. So the fossa is actually seen on the right side and partly on the left. Okay, there's no SA node, AV node, nothing like that on the Left atrium, there's just nerves that come from the SA node to the left atrium, which we'll discuss. Down here in the CT, you can see the blood, so you can see the right ventricle. You could see the ascending aorta, anterior, there it is right there. You can even see the left atrium over here, and there's a left ventricle right there. The esophagus, soft tissue, the thoracic aorta. So everything highlighted in white is blood, unless it's bone. So it gives you an idea of how we can interpret this, but knowing the anatomy is very important. So the pulmonary trunk is in front of the aorta. Okay, so this is the ascending aorta, and I took another CT, and I looked at it. You can actually see the pulmonary trunk up here in front. It's anterior. So you have to do a different angle to see the pulmonary trunk. But there's the ascending aorta. The pulmonary veins are posterior, so you can see them there, left and right. So that just gives you an idea. All right, now let's get down to the left ventricle. Let's talk about the three similar structures you found in the right ventricle. Your papillary muscles, okay? Your chordae tendineae that attach the papillary muscles to the valve, as well as trabecular caudinae. So those three key features are found in both ventricles, and they serve the same purpose in both ventricles, okay? All right, now, from the left atrium, you are now pumping blood directly into the left ventricle via this valve. This is called the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. It's called bicuspid because it has two leaflets, unlike its counterpart on the right that has three. So since this guy is on the facing the anterior and posterior, you have an anterior leaflet or anterior cusp and a posterior cusp. And with that said, you have anterior papillary muscles and posterior papillary muscles that handle that bicuspid valve or mitral valve. This valve is another atrioventricular valve. It is just like the tricuspid. It is a valve that is in between the atrium and the ventricle. So both the bicuspid and the tricuspid are known as atrioventricular valves, AV valves for short, because they handle the valve between the atrium and the ventricle. Their job is one way: take blood from the atrium to the ventricle. That's it. And when they shut, the papillary muscles shut them to make sure they're sealed in there. Okay? All right. So if you look up here in the corner, there's the aortic valve. It's another semilunar valve. Semilunar, just like pulmonary. The aortic valve, when the ventricle contracts, this AV valve is going to shut, and the aortic valve is going to open and allow blood to escape to the systemic side of the body. So it gives blood to the body, the head, the neck, etc., including the heart. So the left side, the systemic side, if you notice, the muscle is thicker because it's going to take blood all over the body and give oxygen to the body through this aortic valve. Okay, so in the left ventricle, all you're going to see is bicuspid. You'll see the three key features we've already talked about. The bicuspid has two leaflets, anterior and posterior, has papillaries for those anterior and posterior papillaries, and you'll have the aortic valve. That's all you can see in the left ventricle. All right? All right. Now, as far as the aortic valve, there's something different than the pulmonary. You have three cusps, just like the pulmonary, except this one is posterior compared to the pulmonary trunk. So because of that, there's a posterior cusp. So you have the posterior cusp and right and left cusp, like the pulmonary valve. Now here's a key feature you do not have in the pulmonary valve. When the blood leaves the heart to the systemic side, it has to feed the heart. So you have a right coronary and left coronary artery that escape immediately after the blood is escaping the ascending aorta. So before your body receives any blood, including the brain, the heart's going to receive the blood first through this coronary artery. So you see a coronary sinus there, and a coronary, not coronary sinus, an opening, a coronary orifice there, and a coronary orifice there for the left and right artery to the heart. So that is a key feature to this little guy. Whereas the pulmonary, you couldn't see that. There are no coronary sinuses because this is a straight artery that's giving a trunk that's going to give it to the pulmonary arteries. So there's no need for holes being there. Whereas on the aortic, there is, because you're going to give it to the left and right coronary. Alright, so this gives you a good relation between them. Here's your pulmonary trunk, here's your aorta, here's your bicuspid valve or mitral valve on the left side, here's your tricuspid on the right side. The bicuspid has two leaflets, hence bicuspid or mitral. It's got the anterior and posterior cusp. The tricuspid valves have 3 leaflets: anterior, septal, and posterior. And of course, the aorta has 3 semilunar cusps. You have the posterior, the right, and the left, whereas the pulmonary trunk has an anterior and right and left here. There is a skeleton, a fibrous network of connective tissue that holds this in place and insulates it. You may see it on the heart, you may not, but we're going to most importantly focus on the valves when I show you the heart and the cadaver. So knowing where they lie is extremely important. Remember, the pulmonary trunk is anterior to the aorta. All right, and of course the bicuspid and tricuspid are roughly in the same plane. They're just left and right. Okay? All right. So when you get valve disease, you have two problems you can have. If the valve doesn't shut right, you can cause insufficiency or incompetence, which means, like the AV valve, if you get blood that that's supposed to enter the atrium to the ventricle, it can allow blood to go back up to the atrium if it has an opening or a problem where it doesn't shut right. If a semilunar valve, like the pulmonary valve, it loses its suction and it doesn't shut when the ventricle loses pressure like it's supposed to, when it's done contracting, then you can have regurgitation there. So sometimes insufficiency and incompetence is also known as valvular regurgitation, because the valve is not letting blood, not allowing blood to enter. To continue on where it's supposed to. It goes back where it didn't come from. So here, it's not the tricuspid valve that's the problem, it's the semilunar valve where the pulmonary valve is showing you the regurgitation. But it can happen both ways. Stenosis, however, is where the orifice narrows and it hardens. So it can leave it a narrow and hardened opening like this, where you have a difficulty with the valve opening and closing. So here you can have regurgitation because the valve is stenotically open, or it can be shut like this where you can't get blood to pass through the valve, which is even worse, because now the heart can't pump blood outside of the body that way. So those are the two types of problems with valves, either stenosis or insufficiency or regurgitation. All right, now with the coronary arteries, I'm going to talk about the blood supply, and it's extremely important how this works. So let's start with the right, and then we'll work our way to the left. As soon as the right coronary artery leaves that aorta, it's going to continue on, and if you notice, it's in between the atrium and the ventricle, so it's going to give blood to the right atrium and to the right ventricle, primarily. Mostly atrium and ventricle, but it'll supply both a little bit. It's going to send an artery immediately to the SA node. So it's called the sinoatrial nodal artery, in that way. Oh shoot, this is not supposed to be here. I meant to put this down here. The nodal artery is coming from the left coronary. I didn't realize I put it up here in the right coronary. So scratch that, move it down here in left coronary. It's not supposed to be up here. What I meant to say is when this thing comes down, it lets off two branches. On the inferior portion of the heart, it lets off the right marginal branch. It supplies a little bit of the right ventricle and a little bit of the right atrium. But most importantly is the posterior side. So when it comes off the posterior side, it lets off the posterior interventricular artery, which supplies mostly the right atrium. All right, so the posterior interventricular artery that I showed you in the heart earlier is supplying the right the right ventricle more than the left. It runs down this ventricular septum and it supplies the right more than the left. So that's an important feature, because if you have a clot in this artery, in the posterior interventricular artery, the right ventricle is going to be the one that's going to be compromised more than the left. And remember that the right side takes care of the pulmonary circuit. So if the pulmonary circuit is not able to allow blood to escape to the lungs, it will back up into the systemic circuit, which means fluid will build up in the systemic circuit. So you'll get what we call systemic edema. You'll start getting fluid in the actual body building up because the heart cannot pump that blood into the lungs like it's supposed to. So it backs up like plumbing would. If you have a clog, it'll back up into the systemic circuit on the left side of the body. All right. Now, the AV nodal artery does supply from the right side, and it gives supply. It supplies the AV node. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. The left coronary artery. As soon as it comes out, it sends off two branches. One that wraps around the atrium and the ventricle, known as circumflex, because it runs around the circumference of the heart. It feeds both the left atrium and the left ventricle, particularly the left atrium more than the left ventricle. And it will anastomose with the right coronary artery in the back, okay? So left and right do anastomose using the right coronary and the circumflex. More importantly, it lets off a big branch coming down the bottom. It's called the anterior interventricular artery. It's also known as the left anterior descending artery, the LAD. This artery runs along the ventricular septum on the anterior side, and he feeds the majority of the left ventricle and a little bit of the right. So I want to emphasize that. He handles the majority of the left ventricle, meaning if you get a clot here, the left ventricle is going to be compromised. The left ventricle handles all the blood going towards the body. So you can see how that's even worse than compromising the right ventricle, because this relies on a boatload of pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury to get it to the body. You compromise that muscle, the pressure decreases because the force of contraction decreases, which means you have a problem. So the anterior interventricular artery can lead to a myocardial infarction just like any other artery, but it can lead to a massive myocardial infarction, which can kill you because it will compromise the left ventricle altogether, which is one of the reasons we call it the widowmaker, because it literally kills people and leaves their spouse as a widow. So that's where it got its name, the widowmaker. It's the chief source for the left ventricle, okay? Whereas the posterior interventricular artery in the back is a chief source for the right ventricle. So when the left ventricle gets compromised, it backs up flow into the pulmonary circuit, and it leads to what we call pulmonary edema. Now you have fluid building up in your lungs because the left side of the heart cannot pump blood out into the body. So I want to reiterate this before I take a break. The anterior interventricular artery handles the left ventricle. If that gets compromised and the left ventricle gets compromised, it leads to systemic edema in the body. I mean pulmonary edema in the lungs. If the right coronary artery, particularly the posterior ventricular artery, gets compromised and the right ventricle gets compromised, then it could lead to systemic edema. So, anterior interventricular artery gets compromised, screws up the left ventricle, backs up into the right side of the heart, you get pulmonary edema. Posterior interventricular artery gets compromised, right ventricle gets compromised, the pulmonary circuit gets compromised, and that leads to systemic edema on the left side of the heart. Okay? All right, I'm going to take a break, and we'll finish this off.